In this video, I'm going to be ranking every adult cartoon from worst to best. Some of you may know that I made a very similar video to this one about a year ago, but I decided to remake it as the last video was missing a couple shows, and the ranking system really wasn't as fair as it could have been. This time around, I'm going to be ranking the shows based on how good they are in their entirety, instead of just ranking their recent season, but I will still be taking into account how good they are today when it comes to the older shows. With that being said though, the list is obviously still going to be a little biased, as a lot of it does come down to what my personal opinions are, so I do encourage you to leave a comment with what placements you think should be different, as well as shows that I may have missed. Anyways, don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy the content, and as always, enjoy the video. When I first started making this list, I had a pretty hard time deciding which show to put in last place. Not because I didn't want to be mean to any particular show, but because there were 4 shows on the list that stood out to me as essentially unwatchable. These 4 shows, in no particular order, are Paradise PD, Velma, and Chicago Party Ant. And if you're one of the unfortunate souls who has watched any of these shows, or more realistically watched a YouTube video about them, then you probably understand why I consider them to be so bad. The shows are all pretty different from each other, but the things that they have in common are that they're poorly written, they rely way too heavily on shock value, dick jokes, or some combination of these two things, and for some inexplicable reason, the main characters of all of these shows are not even close to being likable in any way. And I don't mean this in a way where they don't have depth or they aren't that funny, but in a way where it almost feels like we are meant to hate them. And obviously, there are shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia that managed to get this right, with none of the characters in that show having any redeeming qualities, but the way it's done in the shows I'm talking about is probably done with a lot less intention, and if you've watched the shows, you understand what I'm trying to say. The only way that these characters could actually be enjoyed is if the shows they were in were actually funny, but given their placement on the list, they are obviously not. Across these 4 shows, I don't think there's even one genuinely enjoyable moment other than when they end. And the only positive thing I could say about any of them is that Velma doesn't have the worst art style ever, which doesn't really mean anything to me when the rest of the show is so bad. And to be honest, I would rather have this animation be given to a different show that was actually watchable. There's not too much to say about any of these shows, but to keep it short, Paradise PD's entire sense of humor is built on shock value and stereotypes. Hoops has a plot, but is so cliche and unfunny that it really doesn't matter. Velma is Velma, and Chicago Party Ant has so little happening that I actually forgot it was meant to be a comedy. But yeah, overall these 4 shows are so bad that I decided to have them all be tied for 25th place, both so we could have an even number, and so we don't have 4 individual segments talking about shows that don't really have much to be said about them. So when it comes to all of these, I give them a rating of 0 out of 10, and I would not recommend them in any circumstance. In 24th place, we have a show called Mr. Bircham. If you know anything about this show, you're probably wondering why I didn't just lump it in with the rest of the shows in 25th. And the reason for that isn't that I think it's any better than them, but because I believe that given just enough mental willpower, it can kind of qualify as a show that's so bad it's good, but just barely. And to be fair, it does have a lot more to talk about than the other shows, so I think it's fair that it does have its own section. If you don't know about the show, it centers around a middle-aged man named Richard Bircham, who, in an actual direct quote from the show's producers, fights the woke mind virus. And without directly addressing this statement, the show genuinely misses the mark so hard that it really makes you question what the goal of the show even was to begin with, and it does this to such an extent that even the people on the subreddit of the show's executive producer genuinely despise it. It really seems like one of the few things that we could all come together in agreement on, as even the people who the show was made for agree that it's kind of awful. And this is completely fair, as most of the jokes in the show barely make sense to anyone who actually goes outside in their day-to-day life. And to be completely honest, I don't know if the showrunners had a single concrete idea after coming up with their premise, and even for what it is, Mr. Bircham is just not good at all. A show that it wants to be compared to is King of the Hill, since Mr. Bircham is clearly inspired in some ways by Hank Hill, but the problem with this is that the writers completely missed what makes a character like Hank Hill likable, with Mr. Bircham being a man with almost almost no redeemable qualities whatsoever, and whose only sense of humor is the on-the-nose cliches that don't actually exist in real life. Overall, Mr. Bertram is just another bottom-of-the-barrel animated sitcom that almost no one enjoys, and it fails so horribly at pushing its agenda that even the people who want to enjoy it aren't able to. Anyways, to stop repeating myself, the last thing that I do want to say about the show is that the discourse around it is a bit entertaining. If you know, you know, but yeah, I still give it a 0 out of 10, but with the tiniest bonus, because the fact that the show exists at all is kind of a joke in it of itself. In 23rd, we have Rick and Morty, the anime. When I went to go search if this show was going to be renewed for a second season or not, the first thing Google auto-corrected my question to was, does the Rick and Morty anime get better? And no, I am not kidding. The Rick and Morty anime is, as you could probably guess, a spin-off of Rick and Morty, which on paper doesn't sound like a horrible idea, but execution-wise, it really was a disaster. The first and probably only season of the show suffered from a lot of problems, with the main ones being the poor animation quality, the complete disconnect from the main series, and the fact that literally nothing about the show other than the characters had anything in common with the source material. On top of all of this, it wasn't produced by the same creative team responsible for Rick and Morty, which is kind of ridiculous to me because it kind of just seems like a separate TV show that they slapped the Rick and Morty IP on for marketing. And while as a standalone series, it's not the worst thing ever, it really just doesn't make sense to be Rick and Morty themed, and there definitely isn't too much to say beyond that, because the series itself doesn't have much going on at all, but at the very least, it isn't as obnoxious as the other shows that we've talked about so far, even if it is kind of a train wreck with no target audience. Anyways, yeah, 1 out of 10 still would not recommend. In 22nd place, we have The Cleveland Show. If you somehow don't know, The Cleveland Show is a Family Guy spin-off that ran for 4 seasons from 2009 to 2013, and to be completely honest, it really isn't that bad for what it is. But with that being said though, what it is a Family Guy spin-off, and to be fair, the show did suffer a lot from its pretty weak cast of characters, with pretty much everyone other than Cleveland and Donna being a bit underdeveloped and a bit cliche in a way that makes the vast majority of the episodes feel kind of boring. The show definitely had its moments from time to time, but compared to pretty much every other show on this list, it really didn't do anything too special, and I really can't think of any reason that someone would want to watch this show when there are so many better options out there. Like, the show clearly had some effort put into it, but at the end of the day, it really underdelivered, and I don't think that too many people would disagree with that. Overall, it was an okay show, but I wouldn't recommend it at all because you can just watch Family Guy instead, and for that, I give it a solid 2 out of 10. In 21st place, we have the show that is probably the most overhated show on the entire list, which is really saying something, and at the same time, also the show that the most people are going to get angry at me for, no matter how I rank it or what I say about it. The show that I'm talking about, of course, is Has Been Hotel. And first, let me make this clear. I do not think Has Been Hotel is a bad show by any means, and in fact, I would go as far as to say that I watched season 1 all the way through and did genuinely enjoy it. However, the reason that I have it so low on this list is that, in my opinion, the show tries to do way too many things at the same time, and because of this, I don't think it truly succeeds at any one of them, and in my opinion, isn't really too memorable. What I mean by this is that while the show is funny at times and serious at others, I don't think that it does the best job separating these two, which takes away a lot from the immersion, in my opinion. But with this being said, I do think that the vast majority of criticism that the show receives is pretty unjustified, attacking the wrong things, and that more people should give it a chance. I definitely don't think that's for everyone, but I do think that the show has a clear target audience, and that there's absolutely no shame in enjoying it. Overall, I definitely think that Has Been Hotel could be better, and does have potential, so I will probably be watching season 2 when it comes out. It's definitely a lot better than all the shows we've talked about so far, and because of that, I give it a 5 out of 10, and would maybe recommend it depending on who's asking. Okay, before I reveal the show that's in 20th place, I have played these games before and I need you all to bear with me for a second. I do think that a lot of you are going to agree with this take, but much like the last entry, this is probably going to be one of the more controversial opinions. In 20th place, we have the show Family Guy. And before you run to the comments, yes, Family Guy has a lot of good episodes, and I do think that Family Guy has a pretty strong cast of characters, but let's be honest, Family Guy fell off hard and has not been good in years. In my opinion, the show has only gone worse since around season 9 or 10, and the fact that it still hasn't been cancelled is honestly kind of insulting, as so many other shows that are objectively better have been. With this being said though, it is hard to ignore the fact that the show did have a pretty good run for a decent amount of time, but even so, the good episodes haven't really aged the best, and overall, the only thing Family Guy really has going for it is the nostalgia that we associate with it. The first 10 or so seasons of the show had a good cast of characters with actual comedic timing, and what I'd consider to be a decent sense of humor, and this was nice while it lasted, but literally every aspect of Family Guy has seen such a drastic decline ever since Seth MacFarlane stopped writing for it, and to say that the show is running on life support is an understatement. Like, I have had mangoes better than the last 5 seasons of Family Guy, and people are still defending it. Even at their lowest, they are not griffing it their all. Family Guy is not a good show, but because it's hard to ignore the earlier seasons, I do consider it to be better than Has Been Hotel, as even though it's lost its direction, it at least had one to begin with. Modern Family Guy is so devoid of everything that made the show special that I don't really see any value in revisiting it, and I don't think I can justify putting it any higher on the list. I give the show as a whole a 5.4 out of 10, but wouldn't really recommend it to anyone. In 19th place, we have the show Close Enough. And it really doesn't feel good to say this, but even as a fan of JG Quintel and regular show, Close Enough was kinda mid. It wasn't bad by any means, but in my opinion, none of the episodes were really too memorable, and to be completely honest, I found it kind of boring. The show focuses on a couple in their early 30s navigating being adults, and while the premise is fine, the show does kind of lean into some cliches that I think are overused, and a lot of the jokes really didn't hit too hard for me. It's a show that definitely has some charm, but I do kind of feel like I never really connected with the show's characters or got fully invested into the show itself. Overall, I wouldn't say that Close Enough is a bad show, but even as someone who really enjoyed regular show, it definitely wasn't for me. In 18th place, we have the show Disenchantment. It's one of the only shows that I'm talking about today that went out on its own terms, and overall, it was a pretty good show. With that being said though, I don't think that the show really took too many risks, and while it did maintain a really consistent quality throughout its entire run, which is pretty respectable, in my opinion, the show never really peaked. It has a nice story, and I do enjoy most of the characters, but in a similar way to Close Enough, I never really resonated with them, and overall, I never really felt like the show was getting anywhere. And while I do consider it a good show and can't really find many things to criticize, it does at the same time feel like one of those shows that no one ever really talks about, and it really just seems like it doesn't have the same cultural power that similar shows have, even if it is a decent show. It wasn't really something that I personally could get into, and I feel like I've gotten a lot more enjoyment from most of the other shows that I've watched, and while there is definitely an argument for putting it higher on the list, I still don't really think it did enough to justify it being any higher. And once again, I don't think it's a bad show, I just don't really think it does anything that makes it stand out, which is something that I personally value in the media I consume. I may be missing something, but to be honest, I'm probably not gonna rewatch it ever, so I think 18th place is a bit harsh, but ultimately fair. In 17th place, we have the show Solar Opposites. When it first came out, I was actually a really big fan, and it did honestly feel pretty refreshing, especially compared to most of the other shows that were releasing around the same time. But much like a lot of the other shows that I've placed lower on the list, I do think that the later seasons definitely weren't as good, and while the show's first 2 seasons all have some pretty interesting concepts, and while I do consider to be a pretty good cast of of the main characters. As the show went on, it kind of felt like the newer episodes began to suffer from their lack of actual stakes in each episode, and also kind of like they were running out of ideas, which in my opinion was pretty noticeable. Another thing that I think is really important to mention is the wall subplot. If you've watched the show before, you would know that each season has a single episode focusing on the incredibly lore-heavy story that takes place in the wall, with the first of these episodes being the highest rated episodes in the entire series, and yeah, it's a really good subplot at first. It's genuinely well thought out and well executed, and it's a story that I genuinely enjoyed. Or at the very least, the first two episodes were. The first two episodes featuring the wall are probably the two best episodes of the show in my opinion, but much like the rest of the show, it kind of seemed like they didn't think too far ahead, and by the time we got to season 3's wall episode, it really felt like they were running out of ideas, with the plot getting much more convoluted by the 4th and 5th season. Overall, Solar Opposites has some pretty strong seasons and some really good episodes, but given how it's progressed, I really don't think it compares to some of the better shows out there, and to be completely honest, I'm probably not gonna watch the new season whenever it comes out. I still give it a solid 6 out of 10, and if you haven't checked it out before, I would probably recommend it, although I do warn you that it kinda falls off. In 16th place, we have another show that I think was really good at its peak, but much like some of the other shows I've talked about, such as Family Guy, I do think that it kind of fell off even if it held out for a lot longer. The show I'm talking about is American Dad. At its peak, American Dad was, in my opinion, one of the funniest shows airing on cable television, having a really strong cast of characters, and even if it was a bit formulaic, it was at the very least pretty funny. But I also feel that with time, the episodes have become a lot less interesting, and it really seems like they've started to rely on some of the same things as some of the shows from the beginning of the video. Unlike Family Guy, however, the recent seasons aren't that horrible, and even if they have definitely declined, they're still at the very least watchable. The reason I have it so low though is that while it was a really good option for cable television, no one really watches cable anymore due to the rise of streaming services, and I think that ever since this happened, there have been a lot better options coming out that are both funnier and newer. Overall, I think that American Dad was a really good show, but I can recognize that it's been losing its charm for quite a while now, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. I give it a 6.1 out of 10 and wouldn't really recommend. In 15th place, we have The Simpsons. Let me explain. The Simpsons has a lot of amazing episodes, and the influence that's had on cartoons as a whole is impossible to ignore. But with this being said, at the time of the recording of this video, it was just renewed for 4 more seasons. And let's be honest for a second, we do not need another 4 seasons of The Simpsons. And in fact, I don't think that any show deserves to be renewed for 4 seasons at a time. There's a quote from a movie that says, "A thing isn't beautiful because it lasts," and oh my god, we do not need another 4 years of The Simpsons. It's not a bad show, but having The Simpsons be one of your favorite shows is like having your favorite ice cream flavor be vanilla. Like, it's not weird because vanilla is a bad flavor, but it's definitely not the best, it just came first. With this being said though, I do genuinely think that the early run of The Simpsons is one of the better runs that any cartoon on this list has had, but I really can't justify the fact that it's still running, as it hasn't lived up to its peak in 25 seasons. Not many shows even have 25 seasons, let alone 25 bad seasons. I have seen some people talking about how the recent seasons are a bit better than the ones before them, although I do think it's worth it revisiting the first 10 seasons, even to people who have never really watched the show. 6.3 out of 10, probably worth a watch. In 14th place, we have the show Inside Job. It's a show about a person who works for the deep state working to cover up the world's conspiracies, and while the show only ran for 2 seasons on Netflix before getting cancelled, the reason it got cancelled was kind of chalked up to how poorly Netflix advertised it, as they are known for not taking animation as seriously as live action. But even in its 2 seasons, the show did build a cult following, as despite being a show that got cancelled, it was a genuinely good show. show. It definitely would be higher on this list if it had a longer run than 2 seasons, as it does have one of the more unique premises of all the shows on the list, and a pretty relatable main character, but to be completely honest, a lot of the humor was kind of hit or miss, and while I did enjoy watching it, looking back on it, the show wasn't really too memorable, and some of the episodes were kind of bland. I originally had a lot higher on the list because I do like a lot of parts of the show, and I don't really have too many complaints, but I do think it could have done a lot more with its plot, and in my opinion, it didn't really do enough in its 2 seasons to warrant it being any higher on the list. It's not a bad show, and I definitely recommend it, but I do think that there are a lot of shows that are better. Overall, I'd give it a 7 out of 10, and would definitely recommend if it sounds like something you'd enjoy. In 13th place, we have Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is one of the shortest shows that I have on this list, with only 1 season, which itself is only 8 episodes, but it really goes to show that not everything has to be long to be enjoyable. The show itself is an adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comic series, and it's a lot more story-driven than most of the other shows on this list, but while it is a lot different, I do think that it really shines for what it is, and that it was a really nice change of pace compared to what I usually watch. It has a great sense of humor and a really compelling story, but it does come with a few drawbacks, which I kind of overlooked in the last video, that I think hold it back from being placed any higher. For one, it probably isn't as enjoyable to people who haven't watched the movie, and while the story is fun and does have a nice message, it doesn't really do anything too crazy, and to be honest, a lot of the episodes are just Ramona interrogating different people without too much actually going on. With this being said though, the story does come together pretty nicely with a solid conclusion that I really enjoyed, but overall I don't think that the show is as strong as I originally considered it, and even though it was really enjoyable to watch and explored some interesting concepts, I do think that I had a little recency bias in the last ranking, and that 13th place is a pretty fair placement with all things considered. For most viewers, I give it a 7.2 out of 10, but to fans of the movie or comics, I would give it a 9 out of 10. In 12th place, we have Rick and Morty. Rick and Morty is probably the least consistent show on this entire list, with a pretty strong first few seasons, which were followed by some of the worst episodes of any show on this list. But in recent years, it does seem that the show is making a comeback, and so far, season 8 seems to be pretty good. It's definitely not their best work, but it is genuinely enjoyable. In my opinion, the main thing that carries the show is its cast of characters, as well as the nearly infinite possibilities for each different episode. But when it really comes down to it, a lot of the stories don't really have the same weight that they used to, and it kind of seems like as the series goes on, each action has less and less consequences. After the show gained mainstream popularity for its entertaining and original first 3 seasons, the show took a big step down in quality, especially in season 5, which many fans consider to be its lowest point. But despite its fall from grace, the recent seasons have shown that the producers do genuinely care about making a good show, and ever since Justin Roiland was forced to step down, the show has only gone better. With all of this being said though, Rick and Morty is by no means a perfect show, as some treat it, and while it does have a lot of potential for the future, we will have to see if it can actually deliver. Even with its incredibly low points, I'd still say that it's a decent show, and I really do hope it continues its upwards trend. I'd give the series as a whole a 7.3 out of 10, and much like the last few entries, I would recommend it to anyone who thinks it looks interesting. In 11th place, we have The Midnight Gospel. The Midnight Gospel is an incredibly interesting show, and it was honestly really hard to decide where to put it on this list, with the main reason for that being that it doesn't really compare to any of the other shows, as the format that it follows is completely different. What I mean by this is that there are only 2 recurring characters, and only one of them actually has a physical body, which if you haven't watched the show before probably doesn't make too much sense, but there is a very good reason reason for this. The main character that the show follows is a guy named Clancy, a space podcaster who visits different worlds to interview people. And something really interesting about this show is that instead of having a script, the show relies on animating different clips of actual interviews from one of the creators' podcasts. And while this definitely is unorthodox, it does make the dialogue feel a lot more genuine, as it comes from actual conversations, which brings the dialogue to a level that no other cartoon can really achieve. On top of this, the show also explores a lot of themes that can't really be touched in other cartoons, with many of the episodes exploring kind of dark concepts, and when this is combined with the show's unique animation style, it really creates some amazing episodes that really push the boundaries of what we consider cartoons at all. The only real reason that I have the show in 11th is that the show doesn't have enough characters to resonate with everyone other than Clancy only being in a single episode, and there are only 8 episodes to the show, which isn't really the fault of the show itself, and is more a problem on Netflix's part, but with the only 8 episodes, I can't really put it any higher. Overall, The Midnight Gospel is a really unique series that I would definitely recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it, and I would give it a solid 7.8 out of 10, with the only thing that really brings it down being the lack of episodes. In 10th place, we have the show Moral Oral. Moral Oral was one of the most requested shows that I left out of the original video, and after having watched it, I definitely understand why. Moral Oral is probably one of the funniest shows on this list, with incredible humor and an amazing story that spans its 3 seasons, and it's kind of hard to put into words what makes it so great, but if you've watched it before, you definitely understand. It's another one of those shows that gets a bit darker and a bit depressing, to be honest, but this definitely doesn't take away from its humor, and it's a show that I would definitely recommend. I don't really know what else to say about it, as I haven't finished watching the series, and while I do consider it to be a really good show, I do think that it's at around the same level as a lot of other shows that I'm going to talk about, and the only reason that I rank it below them is I don't think it is as iconic or as memorable as some of them. With that being said though, I definitely recommend it, and I give it a solid 8 out of 10. In 9th place, we have South Park. And since we're in the top 10 now, I do want to make it clear that I think every show in the top 10 is a very good show. And the reason that I'm saying this now is that this list has a lot of different shows, and not all of them were running at the same time. So some shows that were the best of their era aren't even in the top 5. And I just want to say that I consider every show in the top 10 to be incredibly good, even if 9th place doesn't sound the best on paper. Anyways, yeah. South Park is one of the longest running shows on the list, and in the grand scheme of things, one of the more important ones. Throughout its entire run, which is still ongoing, the show has continued to push the boundaries of what's allowed on TV at all, really paving the road for a lot of shows that came after it in many different ways. And by no means is South Park a perfect show, but even with its many shortcomings, especially in the more recent seasons, there's still an incredible amount of amazing episodes that the show will likely be remembered for. With this being said though, I do think that South Park is a little overhyped, as when it came out, it was definitely pushing the boundaries of what's allowed on TV, but with more recent shows having so many less restrictions, it kind of starts to blend in. And also, I do think that not all of the older episodes have aged the best, which is why I don't really recommend a rewatch. With this being said though, it's still a really good show, and the backlog is pretty good, which is why I'm placing it in 9th place with a solid 8.1 out of 10. In 8th place, we have The Venture Bros. Out of all the shows that I missed in the original video, this one was probably the most requested, and of all the shows on this list, I would say that it probably has one of the strongest casts of characters that I've seen. On top of this, it has a really unique sense of humor, and it really only got stronger as the show went on. The only thing that held it back for me was that I didn't really understand all of the references in the older episodes as they were coming out around the time I was born, but even not understanding them, I still found a lot of enjoyment, and I don't really have any complaints. With this being said though, this show was not made for me at all, and while I do respect it and find it really funny, I do think that 8th place is the highest I can put, as it isn't really a show that I resonate with as much as the ones in the top 7. Anyways, I give it a solid 8.2 out of 10, although I will say that in my personal experience, it was kind of hard to get into. In 7th place, we have Bob's Burgers. And listen, I like Bob. I like his burgers. But most of all, I like that despite running for 19 seasons, Bob's Burgers has maintained a pretty consistent quality for almost the entire run. And even just looking at the numbers, we can see that 3 of the 4 highest rated episodes on IMDb all came out in the last few years. And yeah, there were a few mediocre seasons somewhere in the middle, but even at its lowest points, it was never an outright bad show. And overall, it really just has a level of consistency that doesn't really exist anywhere else. But even with all of this being said, I think that as a show, Bob's Burgers can only be so good. It's one of the best animated family sitcoms, but I do think that with its premise, it can only go so far. Like with what I said earlier about its low points still being decent, I think that also works in reverse, where its high points can only go so high. Because of this, I wouldn't go as far as to say that Bob's Burgers is a masterpiece, but I would still say that it's perfect at what it does. To keep it short, Bob's Burgers is a great show, and I would definitely recommend it. I give it a clean 8.5 out of 10, and I don't really have much else to say about it. In 6th place, we have King of the Hill. King of the Hill is one of the most realistic shows on this list, relying on its incredibly subtle sense of humor that really stands out, despite the fact that it doesn't really do anything to stand out. The show has a lot of incredibly unique characters that are really specific to King of the Hill, and it really makes the show feel fresh, even when watching it over a decade after its cancellation. In my opinion, King of the Hill is the best take on an animated family sitcom in the entire genre, and it really gives you everything you could ask for. It checks pretty much every box and only has a few genuinely bad episodes, which is completely fine in my opinion, as it's almost impossible to not have any bad episodes in 13 seasons. The only reason that I don't place it any higher is that while it does do what it seeks out to do, I think that much like Bob's Burgers, there are other shows which do a lot more to warrant them being in the top 5 or higher, stuff that such down-to-earth shows like Bob's Burgers and King of the Hill can't really achieve. With this being said though, I would definitely recommend it to those of you who haven't watched it before, as even as a first-time viewer, I was pleasantly surprised. I do also want to add that this was recorded right before the new season of King of the Hill dropped, so to be clear, I have not watched that, but I will be in the future. But anyways, yeah, I give King of the Hill an 8.8 out of 10 and would definitely recommend. To kick off the top 5, we have Futurama. Futurama is genuinely one of the funniest shows that I have ever watched, and the amount of attention to detail that has in almost all of its episodes is genuinely insane to me. The humor is a lot more subtle than most of the other shows, but when it hits, it really hits. It has amazing humor, down-to-earth themes, and despite taking place over 1,000 years in the future, it's still incredibly relatable. It has an amazing cast of characters and really interesting concepts for most of its episodes, and it almost always manages to deliver. Every time I watch it, I always know something new, and I really do think that it's a genuinely amazing show that you can really get into. With all of this being said though, the show does have its low points that are hard to avoid, which makes sense as the show has been cancelled by pretty much every network that picks it up. And while I do think most of the episodes are amazing, some of the more topical episodes do suffer from being so topical, but it isn't the biggest problem in my opinion. The show is currently in its 3rd era being available on Hulu, and I do think that it isn't as good as it used to be, but I do think that a lot of the newer episodes are still decently strong and definitely worth a watch if you were a fan of its original run. With all of this being said though, it's definitely not consistent enough to be placed any higher, but I do think that it's incredibly underrated, which is why I think it's fitting to start the top 5. I give it an 8.9 out of 10 and would definitely recommend it to anyone who hasn't watched before. In fourth place, we have the newest show to come out, Smiling Friends. And while there is definitely some recency bias in this ranking, it's still definitely a show that deserves to be in the top 5, and given the fact that there haven't been any new episodes in almost a year, I think it's fair to say that recency bias aside, Smiling Friends is still a great show. In my opinion, it's one of the funniest shows to come out in the last decade, and even though its humor is pretty unconventional, it's fresh, and more importantly, it's genuine. It has some of the best dialogue out of every show on this list, and it really feels like it understands that the audience doesn't need every joke to be explained. It doesn't really have the strongest cast of characters in my opinion, but for some inexplicable reason, I think that the way the characters clash really makes up for this. Like, I don't think that any individual character is too memorable, but I do think that the show really thrives when these characters are put together. And I don't think that Smiling Friends is for everyone, but I do think that the way it handles its stories and its characters is done almost flawlessly. Overall, I'm really excited to see what the show does in its future, and I would definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't already. I give it a 9.1 out of 10, and I would definitely recommend it as the episodes are short and you can binge it all in about 3 hours. In third place, we have the show Final Space. And if you haven't heard of it before, Final Space is a sci-fi series that ran for 3 seasons in 2018, and in my opinion, it's one of the best animated shows of all time. Most of the shows this high on the list have a few good elements that they really excel at, but when it comes to Final Space, this show really does it all. It has amazing humor, genuine characters, an amazing story, and on top of all of that, incredibly hard-hitting emotional scenes. Without spoiling too much, since a lot of you probably haven't watched it, the first season of the show works perfectly as its own standalone story, with each episode pushing the story forwards at a consistent pace. And while I personally believe that the show peaked in its first season, with the story getting a bit more convoluted and a bit harder to follow, as well as one scene that I will not mention, I do think that the show makes up for this by being incredibly funny and never really losing sight of what made the show special to begin with. The first season of the show has one of the strongest casts of characters of any series on this list, and while this does change a lot throughout the show's run, the series still managed to stay really enjoyable until the very end. Of all the shows on this list, it's probably my highest recommendation, as it really doesn't get as much appreciation as I think it should, and I think that it can be enjoyed by most people. I don't really have too much more to say because I don't want to spoil anything, but I give Final Space a solid 9.3 out of 10, and if you haven't watched it before, I would definitely recommend it. In second place, we have the show Archer. In my opinion, Archer is the funniest show on the list. It has the best sense of humor and some of the best dialogue, as well as some of the best characters. Pretty much every good thing I've said about all the shows below it are true when it comes to Archer. Every part of the show seems to work together to create something that's better than the sum of its parts. It's not a perfect show, but it is damn near close. It has so many incredibly strong episodes, and somehow managed to keep its high quality for the vast majority of its 14 seasons. And on top of how funny it is, it has an incredibly interesting story, which really allowed the writers to explore so many ideas that similar shows that kept a status quo weren't capable of. And despite how ridiculous some of the plots are, and how most of what happens is pretty unrealistic, the show still managed to stay down to earth, because even though not all actions had consequences, the actions between characters kind of did. And like I said before, it's not a perfect show, but it's consistent, it's incredibly funny, and my only criticism is that it didn't really need 14 seasons, and probably could have ended after the 8th or 9th, but unlike shows like The Simpsons, it didn't get another 25 seasons afterwards, which I can appreciate. If you haven't watched Archer before, I would definitely recommend it. It's a great show, and I give it a 9.5 out of 10. And with that being said, the moment you have all been waiting for, first place. In first place, we have the show BoJack Horseman. Who could have guessed? And yes, you could stop watching the video now. You know every placement. But before you do, if you are one of the people who hasn't watched BoJack before, I want you to understand that there is a very solid reason that's in first place. And if this segment convinces even a single one of you to go out and watch it, I would consider that to be worth it. Anyways, in the last video, a lot of you disagreed with this placement, but at the same time, so many more of you considered it to be the saving grace of my entire list. And even though this is true, I do think that the reasons I gave for the placement weren't the best, even if people agreed with the placement itself. And before I give my updated reasons, I do want to address the main criticisms that the show has received, as I do think they have at least some validity, even if I do ultimately disagree with them. The main criticism that I've seen is that because it's such a dark show, and that this is a list ranking comedies, it shouldn't be in first. And while it is definitely a deeper show than most, it's still really funny. Like, I do think that there are a decent amount of shows on the list that are objectively funnier than BoJack Horseman, but the way people talk about it makes it seem like the show isn't funny at all, and is just this dark, depressing show, which really just isn't true. The other criticism that I hear is that it's simply not good, and while this is by no means a popular opinion, I do think it should be addressed. The main thing that these people say is that on top of not being funny in their opinions, this story itself, which many people praise, is simply not good. They say that BoJack Horseman is not a good person, and that he doesn't really learn anything throughout the entire show. And listen, BoJack is not a good person. He should not be idolized in any way, and to say that he doesn't learn anything is at the very least kind of true. With this being said though, that's the point. In my opinion, a very large part of why I consider BoJack to be the best animated show of all time is that it really nails down how hard it can be to actually improve as a person. And while this is a really specific message, it's also surprisingly universal, and it really just hits hard in a way that I can't fully explain. BoJack Horseman, the character, does grow throughout the story, but it's made clear time and time again that his progress is not linear, and that despite how he genuinely tries to become a better person, time and time again, he always ends up slipping back into his old ways. But even through all of these setbacks, through all of his terrible moments and broken relationships, BoJack does come out a better person. And by no means is end of series BoJack a role model, or even really a good person for that matter, but he is still better. And while it can be hard to find meaning in this, I do think that BoJack's story really highlights the parts of self-improvement that aren't often talked about, because far too frequently so many different TV shows just rush the development of their characters, or show us villains who are redeemed at worst in a couple episodes, and at best in a couple seasons. They paint these characters as either good or bad, but in reality no one is simply good or bad, or at least most people. If BoJack had ended the series fully redeemed, in a better spot than when he started, that would, in my opinion, be a good ending. But because his actions had consequences, and because he doesn't truly recover, I consider BoJack Horseman to be a masterpiece. And when it comes to the series itself, I could go on about its ratings, talking about how it has the third highest rated episode of TV ever, or how it has a perfect finale to pretty much every season. But if you're looking for that, there are already a lot of videos covering the series that will do a much better job explaining them than I do. And also, you could just watch the show. In fact, you should just watch the show. But yeah, to stop rambling, BoJack is an amazing show. I give it a 9.7 out of 10 and recommend it to literally everyone. And I kind of got carried away talking, but also comedy is subjective, so putting a show in first because I consider it to be the funniest doesn't really make sense in my opinion. But yeah, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, which you probably did since you're at the end.